I was brought up in Provo, Utah, and my Uncle Ben Hare, was a contractor. And I think my first job was actually straightening nails when I was about 8. In those days, that was during the war, and you couldn't get nails. So he gave me the job of pulling nails and straightening nails. But at the same time, he was wonderful because he could do anything. He was a craftsman. He could do anything, a mason, a cabinet maker, name it. And so he taught me how to frame a building literally when I was probably 10. So I understood how buildings went together and the name of things that, what a stud was, what a joist was, what a rafter was, when I was very, very young. And so that got me interested. And also I did quite well in the arts and humanities and stuff in school. So that led me to that area. So it started early, learning from my Uncle Ben about how to build a building and how to frame a building. That's certainly part of the story about training. But also I entered school early in those days. We were in junior high school, Irving Junior High School. We were in what was called the AU, Articulating Unit. So that was 7th and 8th grade combined. And then also, if you had a B average or better during high school, you only had to take 2 years of high school as opposed to 3 or 4. So I entered college at 16, which was pretty young. And so I was interested in the humanities and in art. I think a broad education is important. And also, at the University of Utah at that time, because that would have been 1948, about half of the faculty were Beaux-Arts, École des Beaux-Arts from Paris, and about the other half were Bauhaus trained. And so modernism was very much present, and as well as classical. So the education was both modern architecture as well as classical. And that was a really benefit, I think, to me, very much so. So also the apprenticeship is an incredibly important part. Because of skiing, I met a lot of skiers, Dev Jennings and so on, Olympic class skiers. And John Sugden came to Utah right after having been with Mies van der Rohe. So Sugden came out of the military. He was in the 10th Mountain Division as a skier and a climber. And he came to Utah after leaving Mies's office in Chicago. And I became Sugden's first employee. That was 1953, I think, about 53. I left school after about 3.5, 4 years without getting a degree, and I went to work for Sugden, whom I apprenticed with for about 12 years off and on. And having been just out of Mies's office, it was one step out of Mies van der Rohe's office, so he was Mies van der Rohe's protege. So that kind of training gave me a Miesian discipline, which I use today. I think it's critically important. So John was really a huge influence on me. And then also I was asked to teach, interestingly enough, prior to getting a degree at the University of Utah. And I taught basic design from 1964 till about 1967, when I went back east and joined Dan KILEY. Dan KILEY was a very noted landscape architect. So I spent a good deal of time with KILEY, about 5 years, and we did environmental land use studies, and I did a number of high-rise office buildings in Calgary, and so that was an international practice. So I went from kid in Salt Lake City to international practice with Dan. We had clients like IMP and Aerocernan and people like that. So we did all those very large land use studies. So I became a partner of Dan after 1 year. And so being a partner, I was able to be involved in really major projects. I was invited when I was working for Brexton and Christopher as a draftsman, and actually I was an associate at that point, to come to the University of Utah and have lunch at the faculty club. And I said, well, yeah, free lunch sounds okay to me. So I went to the faculty club, and not even thinking I would be asked to teach, because I didn't have a degree, and I wasn't even licensed an architect at that point. But I had been working with Sugden, and I think a lot of people knew about my background with John. And I also was interested in the Bauhaus and so on. So I was talking about Joseph Albers and so on, and it turns out that when I went to lunch, I was actually being interviewed, and I didn't know I was being interviewed. So So they asked me to tell them more about Joseph Albers, and I went on and talking about Joseph Albers and how important he was in the color world in Bauhaus, and that they should buy this book called Interaction of Color. And then Bob would say, well, tell us more about that. So I did, and on. And I had no idea at the time that actually Bob Bliss had been working directly under Albers. So then they just asked me if I wanted to teach. And I said, goodness, I'll say. So I taught half-time until 67, when Dan KILEY came to lecture at the school. And I was very taken by him. He was like a Buddhist, speaking about landscape architecture and so on. So all of this was going on while I also had received a commission from Ted Johnson to do Snowbird ski area. And so I was the original architect for Snowbird. So since Ted Johnson had not acquired all the property yet, I did all the concepts of Snowbird by myself in secret. The reason it was in secret is because he didn't have all the property yet. So it was a strip of mining claims that he had to buy on them all. And so I had a secret office in Sugar House here in Salt Lake City. We had to go up on the roof and go in a window because it was secret. We couldn't go in the front door. And so I did the concepts. I wanted it to be a studious, modern American ski resort. Having been a skier and knew about Sun Valley and so on, they're all basically about Austria or Switzerland or something that's been, and I said, no. I said, this has got to be something different from that. So I established the ideas of Snowbird, the concepts of Snowbird alone. But then after it really started to become open, then I had to form what I called Snowbird Design Group. And that was because I was working for Bob Bliss, being Dean of School of Architecture, and also Brixton and Christopher, whom I was working for. Marty Brixton and Jim Christopher and Bob Bliss and I. So we took the concepts further and developed the ideas and so on for Snowbird, but then it wasn't funded. So Ted Johnson only had the money to acquire certain mining strips and stuff, so he had to do what was called a limited partnership. Anyway, they raised $400,000, which I helped do with Ted, and that gave us the money to actually design. And so that's when we did the more developed ideas about Snowbird. But then it wasn't funded, so Dick Bass didn't come in. He was the money behind Snowbird. He didn't come in until late 69 and a half, and we're talking about 1964, 65. So that was very early. So Dan KILEY had come to the university to lecture because it was very famous. So I said, well, Mr. KILEY, and he said, just call me Dan. So I said, are you a skier? And he said, absolutely, I brought my skis. I came on the train from the East Coast. So we went skiing, and I showed him Snowbird, which at that time was still in its infancy, still a bit of a secret. And so we skied, and then Dan said, well, it's not funded. Why don't you come and join me? Whoa. So having the opportunity to go join Dan KILEY, it's like asking Frank Lloyd Wright to come and join you. Ooh, of course I would. So I went back east and was an associate the first year. And then from 66 until about 71, I was a partner. And then in about 1970, roughly there, I was asked to go back to Snowbird and complete the work with Snowbird Design Group. And so I could have gone to Paris. Sometimes I wonder if I shouldn't have done that. I could have gone to Paris for 3 years and worked on La Défense, or returned to Salt Lake City to do Snowbird. So Dan encouraged me to do the latter because it was kind of my baby. And so I did. So I came back and we continued. I expected to be made a partner at Brixton and Christopher, but I wasn't offered that. But since it was my job, my project, Brixton and Christopher were the architects of record for the first phases for the tram building and so on, based on Snowbird Design Group designs, of course. We built first Lodge 1 and also the plaza. And by the way, a side story, the plaza was Dan KILEY's idea. So Snowbird, if you know about Snowbird, is a very steep run out, and there's no run out really. So they cross the bridge and then go to a plaza and build a village on that other side was Dan's idea. That's about all he did really, but it was a very important move. So the plaza is essentially the core of Snowbird, and that's really important. So I came back and because I wasn't offered a partnership with Brixton and Christopher, basically Ted said, why don't you just start your own firm? So I did. So I was the founding partner of Entelechy. And in Aristotle's De Anima, there's a word called entelechy, and it's spelled E-N-T-E-L-E-C-H-Y in the De Anima. And I changed the name to E-N-T-E-L-E-K-I. I spelled it differently. And that was the name of the firm. And so the notion or the word entelechy from Aristotle means the actualization of the potential to its nearest point of perfection without loss or compromise. So that's really important, because if you actualize a potentiality, then it's not actualizing the actual. So if you look at the creative process, the actualization of potential is quite different than actualizing what you've already seen. So essentially what you're doing is making something visible that was previously invisible, right? That's a creative process. So that's why I named the firm that. And so Entelechy took over after that point, and we did all the rest of the buildings, including the Cliff Lodge, after the termination of Brixton and Christopher. So it's important to note that I started the firm Entelechy with Ray Kingston and Frank Ferguson. So they were the initial partners. I was the founding partner. I brought those two in, and that was different than Snowbird Design Group now, right? So this is now a firm. And so that firm now has evolved into FFKR, which is Fowler, Ferguson, Kingston, Rubin. Frank is an incredibly important architect. I think Salt Lake City needs to realize how important Frank really is. I mean, he did the Israel, the center in Jerusalem for the LDS Church. He did the Symphony Hall. He was the architect for Symphony Hall. Let's make that very clear. A lot of people want to claim a lot of different projects, including Snowbird, and let's be clear about it. Frank was the architect for Symphony Hall, the architect for it. And also, Frank was the architect for a number of other really important buildings. What was called, I think at that time, Utah Valley College, which is now Utah Valley University. Frank did all of the buildings there initially, and also the campus planning. That's all Frank's work. He did the stadium, University of Utah. He's really important. He's absolutely a magician and brilliant designer, brilliant draftsman. He's an artist. He's a superb person. And I've known Frank since college days. We've never had a harsh word. Snowbird was done by a number of people. But our firm, Entelechy, Architecture Planning Research, was not vertically aligned. It was many people. We had a really beautiful project. When that Snowbird became famous, we got many other projects all over the country, in fact, in other parts of the world. And so we actually had the best designers you can possibly imagine. So while Ray was a very, very good designer, Frank is a fantastic architect designer, we also had associates. So the associates were a number of different people, but I remember Jack Gaffney was brilliant, and also Paul Dudek, and those people were all part of it. So we operated that firm quite differently. We operated like a studio. It wasn't a business. It wasn't a corporation. It was a corporation, but we didn't look at it that way. So we would have, it was more like a tight little artistic studio. And that's the way it worked. So lots of people were involved with Snowbird. Many people want to claim it now individually. That's not appropriate. It was not that way. Certainly I was the original author for the concepts and so on, but many other people were involved all the way through. And that's what made it successful. I had basically been involved with Snowbird now for 10 years. And also running a firm, we went from 3 people to 75 people. I think when you begin, I was president, and we had an office in San Francisco as well as Salt Lake City. And I was living on an airplane, which I had been doing too with the KILEY for years. And I wanted to really get a little bit more involved in my own work individually. So I left Entelechy and started my own firm, and I got rid of the name because I wanted just my own. So I just started my own firm called Jack Smith Architect. And so I went to Sun Valley, Idaho, where I'd been a skier for a number of times. So skiing runs through it all. So I came back, and then I moved to Sun Valley, where I've had an independent practice since. Now that leads us to the other side, which is the academic side. So I was involved in teaching. I taught at the University of Idaho. I taught there for a semester. I was a distinguished practitioner in residence for a year. And also I visited Moscow a number of times, and I think right now I'm still an affiliate faculty, although I'm not doing too much with Moscow right now, but affiliate faculty. But I wanted to dig a little deeper, so I went back to school at age 68 or 69, I think, and I went to the University of Hawaii. And because I was already an architect, and also I was also a fellow, I was made a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Because I was already a fellow, I'd won a lot of design awards and so on. It was kind of not necessary for me to be involved in the School of Architecture so much, although I taught there at Hawaii. So they said, well, what do you really want to do? So I essentially designed my own curriculum for a doctorate of architecture. The reason I went back to school is two reasons. I wanted to dig deeper in terms of what architecture really means, architecture with a capital A. And also I wanted to teach more. So I spent 5 years to get that degree in architecture. So that led me then to Montana State University. I didn't expect to teach there. I went there just as a visit. I was doing a large ranch I was doing a large ranch, I guess it was near Bozeman. And I visited the school just for fun. And I saw Clark Llewellyn there, and he said, what are you doing, Jack? And I said, well, I just graduated from school. He said, graduated, so you know you're 69 years old or something, 70 years old. So I said, yeah, I did. But he said, you want to teach? And I said, yeah, but not right now. And he said, yes, you do. You want to teach right now. So he offered me a job at Montana State University, a full professorship, a teaching professor, and I couldn't refuse it. So I thought I'd stay there for a semester or two. I stayed there for 14 years. So I only retired from teaching in 2020, just a couple of years ago. And now I returned to practice, full-time practice in Sun Valley. I'm still practicing, doing projects still. I'm not going to quit. You know, I think retirement's a disease. I don't think you'd want to do it. Architecture, to be an architect and to be involved in architecture, there are sort of three levels of comfort. The first level is to make a physically comfortable building. Is it physically comfortable? Is it warm? Is it warm, you know, in the winter? Is it cool in the summer? Is it going to stand up? Is it going to be whatever? That's just physical comfort. That's just building. Almost anyone can do that. That's kind of simple. The next level of comfort is intellectual comfort. That's more difficult. And what I mean by that is does it make sense? Is it reasonable? Is this appropriate? Why did you do that? Why does the structure do this? Is it reasonable intellectually? So that's the second level of comfort. The third level of comfort is much more difficult and still critically important, and that's the spiritual comfort. Does it make you feel better? Does it make you happier? Does it change the way you live? So we don't just accommodate the way people should live or the way they live normally. We should improve it. We should enhance it. So basically, that's the spiritual side. And I think that's the most difficult. But I think without the three, I don't think it's really architecture. Snowbird is probably the most important project I've done, even though I've done some high-rise office buildings in Calgary, which I'm also proud of. I've done a lot of residences, which I'm proud of. But Snowbird is basically a new village, a new idea, a new concept, the first modern American ski resort in the country, anywhere, actually. So I would say that's probably the most successful, but also I think it's also the most troublesome. And sometimes I feel uncomfortable about certain things because, again, it's a loss, it's a compromise. So I think that one can compromise in need of certain things. One should never compromise in principle. And so the idea was to have a tram go up to a bridge, which is a megastructure, and do a bridge building, which actually spanned the whole canyon, and not have any cars. It was proposed, it's 50 years ago, a little more, and a tramway from the base, but also at the base, that's alluvial fan there, and that property was all Creek Road and all those areas. That was all valuable, all open, and I think Dick Bass could have purchased that for about $1,500 an acre. That would be multi-millions of dollars if you could do it. You can't do it. Now we look 50 years later, and we're struggling with endless amounts of cars, traffic jams. I don't know how much the proposal of the gondola now is hugely expensive. It's too bad they didn't do it 50 years ago. So I think the disappointment was not for being able to see it fulfilled in its entirety. So I think there's certain disappointments in that. But I'm very proud of Snowbird, but I would like to have kept it more tight, less compromise, and so on. The computer, which is huge, you know, it makes the Gutenberg press look like a joke, right? So that computer thing is really important. However, it's a mixed blessing. It's still a tool. And so the difference is that when I was starting, it was about drawing. And when you draw a building, we could learn. Well, I knew Frank Lloyd Wright, by the way. I met him 3 times. I had a visit with him in the afternoon with only 15 of us. And I was just a kid. I think I must have been 17, 18 years old. I raised my hand. I said, Mr. Wright, what do you do first? And he said, young man, that's a very good question. He said, well, I have to tell you, I do it all at once. And I said, whoa, all at once? And so, but that's the truth. So when you're teaching, I hear the most notions about it's plan-driven. It's not plan-driven if you can see the building while you're drawing the plan. So in the computer technology, one is not seeing, you're not drawing lines and not seeing the whole building. I think that's a problem. But at the same time, we can't live without the computer now. You know, I have to do it. So I understand all the programs, how they all work, but I still draw. So I think that the mind is basically, it's about thinking first. It's about the pencil, drawing, because it's the most transparent between the mind and the hand. Then after that, it's making. Then after that, it's computing, and it goes in a circle. And that notion actually is from Renzo Piano. That's his notion about the circular motion of how one creates. So you think, you draw, you make a model, you compute, and you think around, whatever. Right now, what's going on is young people tend not to draw. They tend not to see the building. They tend not to see the whole picture. They don't visualize it because they're too busy doing it, and it's not the same. That doesn't mean to say that it's not important. It's critically important, but it's important as well not to not just think that the machine's going to do it just by itself. There still has to be the basic information has to be put in by the mind first, and so the notion you think about it in your mind really first. And so those things have to be developed, so it's a balancing act. Don't forget that architecture is an art form. I want to hear the word art more often. I want to see the spiritual side. Certainly the computer is important, but you've got to look at the computer as a tool. You really need to draw still. I think you need to think, first of all. More importantly, think about what you're doing. Never compromise your principles. Those things are really, really important. So, you know, I think art and architecture, they have to be both noun and verb. So if art doesn't speak to you, then it's not art, is it? Teaching, as I mentioned before, is symbiotic with practice, but the teaching experience with the students is incredible. You think of the students, and they're really like your children. They really are. The interaction is fantastic. The questions they ask are wonderful. I get letters from students now all the time, and I've made some impression on them, and I think that's important. I like to think about my teaching as not just teaching about architecture, but about life and about broader things, about integrity. It's better to give credit to people who've done the work. To simply assume that you've done something individually or to claim someone else's work is just dishonest, and it's really not appropriate. That happens all too often. So I think that's really important. I think being honest, truth is the most important principle I could think of all the way through. When you're teaching, it's important to let the students understand what the reason is, why does that, how does it perform, what's the nature of the material, why does it bend, why does it do this. Then if you do that, then you'll remember the principle. Plato's Republic is my favorite book. I think it's still critically important. It was written 2,500 years ago. Many of the things in that book are incredibly important. And so it's about utopia. So Plato knew very well that you can't reach utopia because utopia means no place or the other place, you can't reach it. But if you don't continue that utopian idea and try for it, you're never going to do anything worthwhile. Mediocrity is like a disease. If you're around it long enough, you'll catch it. So if you don't, my opportunity with KILEY to be associated with greatness, great architects, was incredibly important. I wasn't around mediocrity, I was around greatness. So I think it's important for a student to understand, or an emerging architect to understand, that you really have to reach for utopia. You're not going to reach it, you can't make it. But if you don't try for it, you're not going to be anywhere. You know, a lot of people work to live. You know, I live to work. You know, I think it's really important to me. It's my life. you know, and that's why I still practice and I'm still involved. It's what I am, you know. I'm an architect, and that's what makes me tick. Thank you very much for asking me to be interviewed for this and to be considered a Utah legend, I guess, in architecture. I think that's quite astonishing, and it's certainly an honor. But yeah, I was born in Provo, Utah, and brought up in Salt Lake City, and left in 67, came back in 74 or so. But anyway, it's a great honor for me to be with you and to be interviewed. I must say, I really thank you for that.